Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this second installment in our series on gender and diversity in allergy and immunology. My name is Victoria Dimitriades, and today Dr. Sarah Henriksen and I will be guiding this presentation with time for discussion at the end of the session. First, I'd like to remind everyone that our Find an Immunologist list is actually live, and we are encouraging all of you to log in and update your profiles for this worthwhile listing. This is a great way to highlight yourself for consideration of speaking engagements and scientific board memberships, as well as for leadership and editorial positions. In the near future, we hope to have a link from the WCIS website directly, which will specifically identify women on this list if they choose to be a part of it. So on to our topic for today. As many of you are very, very aware, the issue of gender diversity and inclusion have been brought to the forefront of many worldwide discussions that we've been having over the last year. In the scientific workforce, inequalities across age, gender, and racial groups have been identified and longitudinally studied, with the recurrent finding that it is not simply a leaky pipeline issue, but the process issue which really needs to be addressed. Our speakers today are leaders in the field of allergy and immunology in their own right, with strong research and clinical expertise, both with great impact in the healthcare systems as well as the communities which they serve. However, they each have also taken a bigger picture look into the system as a whole and how it affects each one of us. I think it's important as we embark on these discussions not to simply acknowledge that there is dissonance here, but to decide now, how will you be involved in this? Will you be an observer or an active participant? What can we do with this information, and how can we take this back to our own institutions to affect real change? And so with this call to arms, I am happy to introduce our speakers for tonight. Our first speaker is Dr. Kim Blumenthal, who is an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School at Mass General Hospital. Her research is focused on the epidemiology and implementation of penicillin and cephalosporin allergy interventions in the inpatient setting. Tonight, using her background in epidemiologic research, she will discuss with us her recent findings of gender-related disparities within the academic allergy immunology community. Our second speaker, Dr. Carla Davis, is a professor of pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine at Texas Children's Hospital. Her research is focused on food allergy treatment and education, more recently in relation to racial disparities in the patient population itself. Tonight, through her work with our National Allergy and Immunology Organization, she will help us to look into our own community as a whole to note differences in representation of race and ethnicity within our workforce. Hopefully, these presentations today can serve as springboards for ongoing discussions and future implementation strategies within our community. Sarah will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A board during the talks, and will be moderating the questions at the end of each session. And with that, I hand over the podium to Dr. Blumenthal. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a privilege to speak to you all tonight, but really a privilege to talk about this issue. I want to start today about women in academic medicine, and then move on to specific sex differences in the allergy immunology workforce, and then finally to speak to the elephant in every room, I think, COVID-19 and moving forward. So to begin with women in academic medicine. The number and proportion of female physicians has increased dramatically in the past 50 years. So in 1970, we had just 827 female graduates. That's just 9.2% of the total. And then in 2014, 8,576 female graduates, which was 48% of the total. Today, 39% of full-time medical school faculty are women. But women are still underrepresented in the upper echelons of academic medicine. So in 2013, women comprised 21% of full professors, 15% of department chairs, and 16% of deans. And actually, only 30% of funded investigators are women. So our ultimate goal is to achieve equality of opportunity and reward in our profession. And it is very challenging to study equality of opportunity. So how do we assess gender in academic medicine? We can assess the quality of reward. And so we can study sex differences in salary, in research, in leadership roles, and in promotion or academic rank. So I want to begin with a study that was published in 2016 in JAMA. This looked at a cross-sectional analysis of sex differences in salary among 10,241 physicians with 24 public US medical schools, and this was as of 2014. And this data is notably the same data that I use later when we talk about the allergy immunology workforce. What this study identified was that this is the distribution of salaries of men adjusted and the adjusted distribution of women's salaries. And they found these were adjusted for clinical time, for research funding, for research outputs, for age, for years since graduation. Everything you could think goes into your salary. And there was an unexplained $19,878 difference in salary between the men and the women. So now let's look at sex differences in research. This was a wonderful study conducted in 2006 that looked at different decades cross-sectionally in really prestigious medical journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine, Annals of Surgery. And as we can see, this looked at first author and senior author overall and in these specific journals. And if we look at the percentage of women overall, we start to think, oh, we're doing better. Of course, this very low percentage from 5.9% in 1970, in 2000, 27.5%. But I think that if we just look at this column here with 2004, we're still comprising 29.3% of first authors overall in these prestigious medical journals. And then if you look at senior authors, 19%, 11% of New England Journal, and then Annals of Surgery as low as 6.7% of senior author positions, even though we just spoke about how the women were comprising about half of the population. And then if we look at institutional support in the very beginning of research careers, this was a study that was got data from 219 applications from 2 New England biomedical research programs. And if we look at the median startup in $100,000, we can see overall the men received a median of $889,000 startup package, and the women $350,000 startup package. And if we look, we can isolate differences. Were smaller, maybe if you were an MD versus a PhD, and the differences were smaller if you did clinical research as opposed to basic science research. And then in this study, they also identified that there were 51 males, or 40%, and just 11 women, or 12%, who reported institutional support of more than $1 million. And that was a significant difference. Now we can turn to sex differences in academic rank. And some of that same data, which was from the Doximity social media network, has data on, well, all of us. And this looked at differences in academic rank. And one main study looked, regardless of what your specialty was, 30,464 females and 60,609 male medical school faculty. And adjusting for all factors known to influence academic rank, which we'll dive into a little bit later, but those same factors, how old you are, your years since residency, publications, grants, clinical trials, and clinical revenue generation, there was still, women were less likely than their male counterparts to achieve full professor status. And so that absolute difference in proportion meant that we were less likely to be a full professor, minus 3.8%, and the confidence interval stayed below 0. And then follow-up studies were performed in many different specialties, and that's what this image is showing here. And so you can see that infectious diseases and cardiology, the absolute adjusted difference is also negative. So the women were not being promoted equally to their male counterparts, even when we adjusted for all factors known to be associated with promotion. And then you can see maybe the difference crosses 0 for gastroenterology, for hematology, as well as endocrinology. This is relevant for our talk today. So sex differences in grand rounds was also studied and published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2017. The authors retrieved grand rounds calendars from 9 specialties, and they got them from 15 to 45 departments per specialty in 2014. And they identified that female representation ranged from 19.6% to 53.3%. And you can see on this graph a little bit, this is session presentations by women and the percentage. So you can see where the median line falls, which for intramural speakers was just below 30%, and for extramural was just above 20%. And then by different specialties, so you can see that OBGYN was sort of this outlier with over 50% representation, which might have to do with their overrepresentation of women in the specialty generally. But otherwise, a very sort of diverse smattering, with internal medicine falling kind of right on that median line. And then to go to the flip side of institutional support, not those junior investigators and their startup packages, but rather their endowed chairs. So this was a study just published this year. This study looked at the top 10 schools of medicine based on NIH funding in 2018. And they retrieved the endowed professor, to the endowed chair and full professor lists directly from those medical schools in 2019 to 2020. They had a total of 1,654 full professors in the sample, and they identified that 411, or 25%, held endowed chairs, and that there were 76 endowed chairs who were women, or 18.5%. However, when they looked among the full professors at who got in the endowed chairs, they identified, even after multivariable adjustment, which will be a theme here, there was a significant difference in that women full professors were less likely to hold endowed chairs than men. And their adjusted odds ratio is 0.70, and their confidence interval got close to, but did not overlap with 1. In that study, they also isolated rheumatology, allergy, and immunology. So I thought it would be interesting to look at that before we dive into this specialty further. As we know, rheum, allergy, and immunology is largely a small fields, and they identified just 8 women with endowed chairs in rheumatology, allergy, or immunology. And that was 27.6% of the population, whereas the male rheum, allergy, immunology, they identified 24, which was 36.9%. So obviously a higher frequency among the men. So now let's move more deeply into sex differences in the allergy and immunology workforce. So what do we know about the allergy immunology workforce? In 1989, allergy and immunology was just 10% women. In 1999, 20% women. And in 2004, 25% women. In a 2017 survey that was conducted by the Quad AI membership, they identified that there were 37% of leadership roles held by women. We know that the Quad AI board and the ABAI board, women comprise about 50%. And then if we look at some of the journals in the allergy immunology, women comprise 27% of the editorial board, 24% of the editors, however, 0% of the editor-in-chief roles. So we took data from Doximity as of November 10th, 2014. We were able to identify all of the same variables as used in that prior JAMA and JAMA internal medicine studies. We had sex, age, residency completion year, U.S. medical school faculty appointment, rank, number of publications in PubMed. We had both total and first and last publications. We had active grants from the NIH, and that was from the Reporter database. We had clinical trial investigations from clinicaltrials.gov, Medicare reimbursement, as well as whether or not you were at a U.S. News top 20 medical school. And we did the study using all allergy and immunology physicians with an academic title at a U.S. medical school. We considered the outcomes of academic rank and authored publications. So we identified in total 5,454 allergists that were in the Doximity sample, and 1,777, or 32.6%, were female. There were just 506 academic allergists. So we're down in, as far as academia is concerned, at now down to 9.3% of allergy and immunology physicians, and then just 184 were women. What I'm showing here is a brief table 1 looking at differences, raw, unadjusted differences between the men in that second column and the women in the third column, academic allergists. And those p-values in the column all the way on the right just represent univariable tests between the frequencies. And the entire population of 507 is in the first column. So as we can see, the men were older than the women. So age 56.9 versus 47.9. So that also meant that they had more years since residency, so more experience, 26.4 to 16.6. There was no difference in whether or not you were in a top 20 school. When we looked at NIH grants, mean NIH grants was higher for men, 2.07 to 0.995. At least one NIH grant was almost a quarter of the male population, but just 13% of the female population. If we looked at clinical trials investigation, this wasn't a significant difference. However, 16% of the men were involved with at least one clinical trial, and 10% of the women were involved with at least one clinical trial. And then Medicare payments was used as a marker of clinical productivity. And so this wouldn't be true if you were a pediatrician, but it's the best way from large data we can get at knowing how much you're practicing clinically. And you can see that the men also had more billable dollars than the women, 44,000 versus 23,000. So then we looked at first at publications, and this is just raw numbers, mean numbers of publications, the male academic allergists versus the female academic allergists. And if we look, they're remarkably different. But I told you that the men were much older than the women, so it's not really fair to just look at these unadjusted values. So we have to at least adjust for age. It turns out when you adjust for age, that there were 17.8 publications for women and 25.8 for men. And that was a significant difference. And in fact, when we looked at first or senior author publications only, you were also able to see that the mean was 12.2 for women and 19.4 for men. So when you put this another way, the same age allergist in academia, the males will have 8 more papers and 7 more first or senior author papers than the women. So now let's turn to academic rank. In all, the same setup here, this is the univariable analysis where you can see that there are 126 male full professors in academic allergy, that's 39%. And in the women, it was 26 or 14%. I think I could stop there and just say in 2014, it was very sad that there were only 26 full professor women. Certainly, that's a really low number for the whole US. Probably don't have many missing because Doximity has almost complete capture from our NPI numbers and everything else. So that's meaningful. But then we started to say, okay, is there a difference if we adjust for just age again, like the publications? And so the age-adjusted rate of full professorship was actually significantly different for men versus women. So 26.6% among men versus 17.3% among women, and that p-value sneaks in under 0.05. When you compare full or associate versus assistant professor, which is another way to group the outcome and do it age adjusted, then that doesn't become significant. But it seems like there's more in the full professor status, there's more than just age accounting for this. So then we looked at more multivariable analysis. And this demonstrates the adjusted mean for full professor on the left versus assistant or associate. And then on the right was associate or full professor versus assistant. And the take-home message here is really that once we controlled for all of those differences that we reviewed between the men and women academic allergists, their publications, their Medicare revenue, their clinical trials, their grants, and their years and their age, that there became not a significant difference. So there isn't a detectable bias left over in promotion in our specific field. Now, our specific field is very small, and actually I told you that full professor women were 24 in number. So you could argue, well, first of all, their age didn't explain the whole picture. There's some bias in publications. And then, of course, maybe this sample is just too small for really getting down into the weeds here with multivariable adjustment. So now I'd like to turn towards more optimism. Maybe not optimism yet. So before COVID-19 hit, there were many sex differences in domestic responsibilities of women in academic medicine. And so this was a study that was done in 2014, the same data time as that doximity data I've showed you throughout the evening. And this looked at 1,049 NIH-K awardees. And they did a survey from 2006 to 2009. And the take-home punchline here, which wouldn't surprise any women, especially if you're on a K award or pursuing a research career, that women with partners and children spent 8.5 more hours per week on domestic tasks than their male counterparts on those same awards. So that was where the place we were starting from when this happened last spring. Now, there are many problems with COVID-19, but one of them certainly is what it's done to our lives. And this headline I will not forget when the New York Times had this out on May 8th, 2020. I will read it because it is funny. Nearly half of men say they do most of the homeschooling. 3% of women agree. And you can see this is the survey that they conducted of 2,200 adults, and they conducted it early in the pandemic in April when, and clearly this says men said 45% of them did most of the homeschooling, women said 80%, and the women, here's the 3%. They only 3% of women said my spouse is doing more homeschooling than me. So certainly a lot of things to consider. I'll read also from this nice viewpoint that was published. It says, now more than ever, physicians are stretched in their personal and professional lives. This may be even more true for women physicians. And of course, it is very much more true for women physicians. And then here, women physicians do not have trouble balancing competing demands any more than men physicians do. It is simply more common expectation that women physicians will adjust their professional lives. The COVID-19 pandemic is requiring additional adjustments. Many of these adjustments will be made disproportionately by women physicians. So coming from a place of inequity, we are now at a place where these are a few more New York Times headlines. Usually this is animated, but we don't have animations in this format. So it says the pandemic will take our women back 10 years in the workplace. Pandemic imperils promotions for women in academia, how women are getting squeezed in the pandemic. And then I will just show you a photo of how I was squeezed in the pandemic, because I was literally being squeezed by a child behind this chair you see me in talking while I was on a telemedicine call. So we've all have new challenges, and those challenges are resulting in research output changes. So this here is a study that was just published in JAMA Network Open, and it looked at metadata from medRxiv and bioRxiv. And they determined gender of the authors through an API, and they identified differences in percentages, and they call this the gender gap, male versus female. And so here we are down here on the left in the health sciences, which is medRxiv, and we have a gender gap of 23%. And then COVID happens and our gender gap increases to 55%. And then if we look on the right in the life sciences, it doesn't look like nothing much is going on there. So it does seem to be research output differences. And then if we look specifically down at COVID research, like who is publishing COVID research, which we see all the time, it turns out that this study looked at almost 2,000 COVID-19 papers authored by US-based first and last authors. And they estimated women's estimated share of authorships first, last, and overall was 19%, 5%, and 8% lower in the COVID-19 sample versus the year before just a general sample. So it does look like in general, we are being squeezed with academic outputs, and particularly also in COVID-19 research. So what can we do about this, and how can we move forward? So some of the things we can do are to make sure that our institutions are transparent, have transparent promotions process, salary processes, leadership opportunities. Do we find out about leadership opportunities in the same way? Are there search committees? Are there women? Are there women on those search committees? Grant review committees. We also need organized efforts to learn from institutions and specialties that have achieved sex parity. What do these institutions do differently? What are the best practices that we can disseminate? And then now more than ever, we really need to encourage our institutions and our professional societies to support women, to maximize flexibility in clinical schedules, to expand programs for parental leave, to offer new funding vehicles, potentially for women entering research or sustaining research. So now I just want to review a 2016 Lancet article that was answering the question, why do women choose or reject careers in academic medicine? And this was a review of 52 studies that were conducted over a very wide time frame. And most studies were from North America. And if we look here, the reds are sort of refuting with or without methodologic limitations. So I kind of focused on places where we had a lot of blue. So what can we do to support women and help women continue to choose academia? One thing we can do is participation in research can encourage women into academic medicine. Good supporting research data behind that. Women sometimes are interested in teaching more than research. So making education tracks, making protected time for teaching or compensation for teaching more accessible. Women role models and mentors is so important. So having networks, even just like today, having networks and groups where you can have professional networks and mentorship be available to you. And then finally, that last one that's fully blue is gender discrimination, unconscious bias. And here that we cannot tolerate any discrimination or bias, and we have to call it out and support each other. Finally, I do want to mention this survey that was conducted in my home institution. The Mass General Hospital Department of Medicine conducted a survey last year of 553 faculty with a response rate of 56%. And both women and men responded. It was just about job satisfaction in academic medicine and at Mass General specifically. But then in a multivariable analysis, they were able to identify factors associated with job satisfaction. And those included things that we can do, at least our leaders can do, especially for women and especially for women now, which is feeling valued was associated with job satisfaction. Feeling treated with respect was associated with job satisfaction, and then working in a social and supportive environment. And of course, this happened before COVID-19, so it's very challenging, and we have to be more creative about how to work in a social and supportive environment. But these are the things that I think will help retain and encourage women graduating our fellowships to stay in academia. And finally, I want to end with this great paper that was also just published and showed up on one of my many women Facebook groups, which was called 10 Simple Rules for Women PIs During a Pandemic. And you can replace anything with PIs just for women in academia or immunologists or whatnot. And I think it was so great because I thought to myself as I was opening it up, there are no rules. And then rule 0 was there literally are no rules. So it was very timely. And I think some of the suggestions I'll read because I think I'm trying to take them to heart and I think that they might be helpful as well. So finding a peer group of women to provide professional support is very important. You can say no, you can drop something. I think that that's a novel idea that you're allowed to drop something. And when you have more energy to do more than the minimum, support women and other underrepresented groups. Anyway, I'll leave it here so you can look it up. It was fantastic. With that, I will end and just say thank you to my research team who helps me largely do drug allergy research, but every now and then I do something related to epi, like women in academia, and recently we did some COVID asthma work. And my funders, and then I actually have been very privileged to be largely mentored by wonderful females in academic medicine. I've listed some of my mentors here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I want to turn it over briefly for questions, and then we'll come back after our second talk and we can do additional questions. There's one right now in the chat, and if you have any more, please add it now. Kyla Hildebrand is asking if you have any data on the timing of age re-promotion differences between genders.
So that could be studied, and I'd say we didn't look at that because it was a static cross-sectional data set. So it would be easier to look at it every year and to sort of build these profiles. But in general, the studies have supported across all academic medicine that at least a full professor, there is a bias that exists that we can't account for by any clinical or research factors. So that didn't pan out for every single specialty, but it seems when we look cross-sectionally at the data. But I think to really do that well, we would need sort of multiple years, more longitudinal data.
Fantastic. That's great. There's another question that I think we'll come back to at the end, just to let Dr. Davis go through her presentation first. And then, of course, please continue to put questions in the chat so we can go through the rest of them at the end. And thank you again, Dr. Blumenthal, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Carla Davis, and I think someone might be going to introduce me, but if not, I can introduce myself. Oh, yes, no, I was introduced in the beginning. I'm so sorry. I'm so pleased and really honored to have been asked to speak with you today about diversity in the allergy immunology workforce. I am at Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital, and I would say that because I'm in an underrepresented group, this has been very enlightening for me to delve into what is the diversity within our field. And so I'm happy to share with you today what I have discovered. See if I can move my slides. There we go. So these are my disclosures. I'm not going to talk about anything from my funders today in this talk. So today we're going to talk about really what is diversity and what's the importance of diversity. We'll talk about the current state of the physician workforce as well as the allergy immunology workforce with regard to diversity. We'll talk about best practices. What should we be doing in order to promote that in our institutions? And what you individually can do, not necessarily just on an institutional level, but on an individual level in order to promote diversity. So the definition of diversity, well, there are a range of human differences, and diversity is just really multiple characteristics that include, but really aren't limited to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, social class, physical ability, so disabilities, religious or ethical value systems, national origin, as well as political beliefs. All of these really contribute to the diversity of us as a human race. So what are the underrepresented groups in medicine? Well, these, when you think about underrepresentation, you're thinking about racial or ethnic or other populations that are underrepresented in the medical profession relative to the general population. And so you may hear at times URM, and that's what that means, underrepresented minorities in medicine. And so here are really what are considered the underrepresented groups, because all minorities aren't necessarily underrepresented in medicine. So among racial and ethnic groups, Black and African Americans, Hispanic and Latinx people, American Indians or Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and or Pacific Islanders. I mentioned individuals with disabilities, individuals with disadvantaged backgrounds. This basically has to deal with socioeconomic status in many cases. So homelessness, foster care system involvement. If you have qualify for a federal free or reduced lunch program, no parent who is college educated. If you needed a federal Pell Grant, if you were on the nutrition assistance program, and if you're in a rural area or have low income and are in a healthcare provider shortage area. So these are the groups that that typically are not as well represented, and we'll talk about the specific details of that. So what does this mean? If we look at science and engineering, which in many cases precedes coming into the field of medicine, groups like Asians and whites have higher representation. And so if we think about the U.S. residents, so the general population, Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Alaska Natives are about a third or 31% of the population. Well, if we look at science and engineering, 21% of underrepresented minorities will get a college degree. And in a doctorate, it goes down to 13%. And then employment in science and engineering occupations, it goes down to 11%. So we can see that there is a disparity there. So why is diversity important? Why should we even care about this? Well, the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Institutional and Policy Level Strategies for Increasing Diversity put out a report called In the Nation's Compelling Interest. And so it looked at, what could be the advantages in the healthcare workforce of having diversity. Well, diverse teams, they're more capable of solving complex problems. In research, investigators will ask different research questions based on their background and experiences. So research will be really more heterogeneous and cover all the problems if you have a more diverse workforce. Diverse providers may also expand access to healthcare in underserved areas, and it does result if there is a concordance between a provider and a patient with greater patient choice and potentially satisfaction. I believe diversity in the workforce really helps promote health equity. So health disparity is the health difference that's linked to some disadvantage, whether it's economic, social, or environmental, and this would adversely affect groups, right, that have systematically experienced a greater social or economic obstacle to health. And equity is the kind of the opposite of disparity. It's where you actually provide to disadvantaged populations the support in order to reduce the disparity and any social determinants of health that may negatively affect a person's health. And so this picture just really demonstrates how this little boy with the purple shirt on, he's getting the exact same resources as the adult and the little boy with the red shirt, but he just can't see the baseball game because of his state in life at this time. He actually needs more support in order to be able to see the baseball game. And in this particular case, seeing the baseball game is a representation of really reaching maximal health status. And that's what we're all seeking for all of our patients. Diversity can foster innovation and creativity. There was an experiment that assigned students to racially diverse or non-diverse small group discussions, and essays of those small groups were analyzed. And the essays of those in the diverse groups were more complex in the differentiation and integration of multiple perspectives compared to those that were in the homogeneous group. And then we're looking at mock juries, experiments that assign individuals to either racially diverse or non-diverse groups found that when diverse groups were in the jury, a wider range of information was discussed compared to those that were all white. So it does foster a discussion of different ideas. Diverse teams improve business performance. There's overwhelming evidence. Scott E. Page showed this in his book, that teams that include different kinds of thinkers outperform homogeneous groups on complex tasks. He calls this the diversity bonus. And so, as discussed before, improved problem solving, increased innovation, more accurate predictions were all associated with diverse teams. So we do have an advantage to having people who are not like us around. Also, diversity can mitigate interpersonal racism in the workforce. Interpersonal racism is defined as prejudice and discrimination experienced by members of a dominant racial group, or between these members, the dominant versus the stigmatized racial minority. It can be intentional or unintentional. It can include acts of commission or omission, things that are done or not done, and implicit bias plays a role. I know that you all as a group have addressed that as well. And I think this implicit bias can contribute to different behaviors, like just lack of respect or suspicion of someone, devaluing someone, scapegoating or dehumanizing. The other thing that diversity can mitigate are microaggressions, or just these simple acts of racism that can occur on a regular basis. The perpetrator may not even know that they have been offensive to the racial minority group person. An example is somebody says, "Oh, you speak so well," that a white professional might say to a Latinx professional, not really meaning to cause any kind of harm. But still, the Latinx professional assumes, or that statement would assume that they expected the Latinx person not to be able to speak well. And so I think we all have to think about the impact of our actions more so than the intention. And really, dialogue is helpful, and diversity can help mitigate this. So there is also the potential for a decrease in workplace harassment. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 2015 showed that when they looked at harassment in any private, state, local government settings, gender and race really accounted for the majority of the charges, the reasons why people were harassed. And they found that harassment was really more likely to occur when there is a lack of diversity in the workplace. So diversity could have a potential decrease. On the opposite end, when you have diverse groups, you have the potential for some harassment, but this is less so than if you really have just a constant, open communication environment with a diverse workforce. So what's the current state of our field? Well, this is diversity in the United States right now. 60% of United States citizens are white, non-Hispanic white, and 19% are Hispanic or Latinx. 13% are Black or African American, 6% are Asian, and then only 0.2% are Native Americans or Alaska Natives. When we look at physicians, we can see here that really there is an overrepresentation of Asian ethnic groups in the physician workforce, and then about the same in non-Hispanic white physicians. We can see that there is really an underrepresentation of Hispanic and Latinx people and Black or African American people, and so and then Native Americans are also underrepresented because it's about 50% in the physician workforce. So we've got a ways to go. When we look over time, when since 1980 to 2012, and this was the last time that AAMC actually looked at these trends and graphed them in this way, we can see over these 3 decades that women white women physicians actually had a bit of an increase, but it's kind of leveled out over these past, and this was actually almost a decade ago now. We need more data, and so kind of approached the proportion, or I should say the number of white men physicians. Asian women and Asian men physician actually increased over time, but there was really just kind of a flat trend in Hispanic and Latinx women and men, as well as Black African American women and men, and American Indian and Alaska Natives. So there's definitely work to be done to improve diversity of all groups with physicians. What about the pipeline to the allergy immunology workforce? Well, the process is lengthy, right? You have to get through college, medical school, residency, fellowship, and then become the practicing allergy immunology physician. And in preparation for this talk, I said I wanted to share with you all really what was the state of our ethnic groups in our field. And so the academy, the college, as well as the board of allergy and immunology have really not tracked race or ethnicity in their constituency on a regular basis. And so I'm hopeful that in future years, we'll be able to see these numbers. There is a pipeline approach to try to increase diversity of the biomedical research workforce. And so this graph just shows that that the percentage, if you look at the blue and the gray bars, that's the underrepresented men and women. And so when you go from an associate's degree on the left all the way up to full professor, this kind of is a graphic of what we heard from Dr. Blumenthal, that really underrepresented women really kind of drop off from associate's to bachelor's degree, and then even from a master's to doctoral degree. And then also underrepresented men also do have a decrease in their representation along the pipeline. This occurs in well-represented, so white women as well, and you can see here that the yellow bars are increasing, and so there is definitely work to be done. And as she mentioned, really focusing on retention, continuity, flexibility, and innovation across these branch points in the career where the diversity decreases is important. Mentoring, training, and assessment of good mentorship is important. And then increasing positive research experiences. She also mentioned that. The graph that's the blue and the orange graph shows that the diversity-focused funding in NIH is actually focused more in undergraduate and predoctoral stages in the career of young physicians rather than later on. And so this is an area of improvement. You heard about the academic medicine faculty disparities. 39% of full-time faculty are female, and then only 4% of full-time faculty are members of an underrepresented minority group. So there are challenges in getting that mentorship and those role models. There are challenges in diversity because, in general, non-white physicians are more likely to practice primary care compared to white physicians. Nearly a quarter of American Indians or Alaska Natives actually practice family medicine. So there is a culture there that needs to be overcome in order to recruit underrepresented minorities into specialties. And then this is the U.S. matriculant to medical schools. Underrepresented minorities make up 23% of matriculants to medical schools, not that far off of the 31% in the U.S. population. And if we look at pediatric and internal medicine residencies, you can see this is from the residency application system from 2019 to 2020 is this data. And the number of applicants to both internal medicine and pediatric residencies are majority white and Asian applicants, Black, Hispanic, and American Indian and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander account for about 20% of these applicants. And when we look at AI fellowship program applicants, we can see here that over the past year, there was an increase in the number of Asian applicants, the number of white applicants, and Hispanic applicants. The number of Black applicants was flat, and these graphs look different. There really is not as much representation of Black or African Americans in this pool. So we do have some work there to do. We can see here we start off with 30% diversity in the population, and then along the way from college to residency, it's pretty. Although it doesn't represent the U.S. population, it's still constant. And then we get to AI fellowship program, and it kind of drops off. And this is a question mark here that I hope in the future we'll find out. So what are the best practices to really achieve a more diverse workforce? Well, institutionally, the institution has to commit to leadership that's appointed to set the vision for improving workforce diversity. There must be coordinated activities that are really established to align with the goals and the vision. There have to be sufficient people and infrastructure in order to ensure the activities are really congruent with that vision. And there has to be an investment to cover the time and effort that's put into these activities. I just want to share a success story from our institution. In our pediatric residency, the institution made a commitment to try to increase diversity and implemented a multipronged holistic approach in order to try to recruit pediatric residents from racial and ethnic backgrounds that are underrepresented. So we started an underrepresented minority second look event. And the I stands for in, so underrepresented in medicine. This started in 2013. It's a 2-day event specifically for underrepresented minorities that were applying. And they met the department chair, other faculty, and in non-structured settings like a dinner, and to improve their I would say affinity to the institution. And so you can see here that those that match underrepresented minorities that matched our institution really increased over 2013. And so since the program started, we can see here that the composition of the resident workforce actually became more diverse, up to kind of really 30%. From initially 11%, so a threefold difference. So this really does matter, and is a best practice. In our hospital, a comprehensive diversity, equality, and inclusion program has been implemented. In our hospital, it's quite diverse. 44% of the physicians are white. 8% Hispanic, 8% Black African American, 24% Asian, and 16% American Indian. So we do have quite diversity. In order to improve communication, there was actually a crowdsourcing tool called Waggle. And this asked people really what's one thing that they should start doing in order to cultivate open and honest conversations. And so this gives results. This is something that an institution can implement, and to try to increase diverse representation, have more dialogue, and then help people develop skills for crucial conversations, being able to listen and be open to divergent thinking. Also, leadership and making sure that leadership is aligned with being inclusive. Addressing unconscious bias is just a really important part of an entire plan in order to increase diversity. So what are the remedies for lack of diversity in the AI workforce? Well, institutional policies and practices. You can advocate for best practices that we've talked about. Interpersonal bias. Check your own implicit and explicit bias and be mindful about changing practice. If you have internalized bias, attitudes that pop up when you work with some trainees rather than other trainees, to self-reflection to determine whether that has to do with any kind of bias is important. So what you can do is make sure that you participate in an implicit association test just to get a sense of where your biases might be. introspection, being mindful, and having a perspective of considering the other person's point of view, as well as really trying to evaluate people based on their characteristics rather than what might automatically pop into your head. We all have that. We've seen a person that looks like that person, and so that other person's characteristics pop in our head. So we just have to consciously combat that. So in conclusion, really improving diversity in the allergy immunology workforce, it's important to promote health equity. There is significant disparity in the proportion of underrepresented minority physicians, AI physicians, as well as medical school faculty. And institutional policies and practices really can help. I think that we individually also can help and advocate for best practices and call out microaggressions, make sure that we're not participating. So that is that's all I have to share with you. Thank you very much. I would like to take questions. This is the wonderful Texas Children's Hospital where we are, and I'm really pleased to have shared this with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. That was a fantastic talk. During your talk, Victoria shared with us from a WCIS survey back in 2017 that, and Victoria, maybe you could clarify if the entire survey was only of our female CIS colleagues or if it was the entire group, but the racial breakdown and ethnic breakdown was 55% Caucasian, 19% Asian, 14% Hispanic, Latinx, 3% African American or Black, 0% Native American, and 0% Pacific Islander.
Yeah, so it really shows you with that particular, so CIS, right? You are really international, and it sounds like from those percentages, the Black and African American proportion is underrepresented, as well as the Native American proportion is underrepresented, whereas the other groups are closer to that in the population. So we've got some work to do.
And Dr. Dimitriades just clarified that these percentages were for our female colleagues, but that the fractions for our male colleagues were quite similar.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's good. Were those the U.S. Physicians, or were those the international, including the international?
That's a great question. I think it was a pan-CIS members group, but I don't know if it would be broken down by folks from other countries who also had membership in CIS. That's a great question.
It is, it is both, it is international members, but most of them were represented by North and South America.
Mm-hmm. So that may be also maybe why your Hispanic, Latinx
correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would love to leave with a question. I was really struck by your data for the residency program and how you guys were able to affect such a striking change. I was curious if that's been tried in other stages of training, or if you could give us a little more information on how we could implement a similar program, or if you guys have published sort of this strategy so that other folks could implement it locally.
It's not quite published yet. Dr. Susan Gillespie at our site is kind of the lead on that, and they're working to publish that data. And I'm really not aware that there are really other programs just like that, because it really is. It was a very unique program that was spearheaded really by our department chair, who was very outspoken in wanting to improve diversity efforts. So it is extremely striking, and I think is a model for other institutions to implement. But it really does take institutional commitment, right? It does take funding of the dinners and the time, as well as the extra day for the underrepresented minority groups to stay at the institution. So I think that is really the best practice there, in finding committed people.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. That's inspiring. I'll definitely look out for that publication. If we could bring back Dr. Blumenthal, we have a question from Dr. Cooper back from her talk, saying that the statistics on the editors at major journals were striking. And I think this is one of those uncompensated academic responsibilities that can be more challenging for women juggling work and home. And one of the reasons I paused this question is because I thought you both would have thoughts around these issues. any thoughts on how to support women in these roles and not overwhelm ourselves with committees, other efforts, other roles that don't provide effort?
Yes, actually, that's a great question, Dr. Cooper. I was unaware of this, but when you are an editor-in-chief, and in many cases, when you're an associate editor, for instance, associate editor of JCI, or editor-in-chief of JCI, there's effort associated with that. And so academicians who are in that role really, do get some effort. And I think that it's wise for us as women, if we ever, if you're offered that opportunity to negotiate for effort, because it does take time. And if it's not offered, then you should bring it up, because there's precedent for that.
Yes, and Dr. Cooper just jumped back in, thank you, saying maybe we weren't as good at asking for effort. I think it's a great point. I definitely wouldn't have recognized that that was an option for those kinds of non-academic or academic proximal responsibilities. I don't know, Dr. Blumenthal, if you have additional thoughts on that issue.
Just the editorial boards were more balanced and appropriate for like our percentage of academic allergy in general. If you look at just the editorial boards, we had the kind of appropriate representation. Interestingly, that is an uncompensated role. Just noting that it was also the leadership roles. When in that Quad AI survey, we were about on par with our the gender breakdown in allergy immunology generally, but many of the leadership roles, it was mixed leadership roles, including things like program director and assistant program director, which are things that women have a higher proportion of women than when they were looking at clinical directors, and chiefs had a lower proportion of women. So if you dig down deeper, it does seem that, yes, I think we should all be better at advocating for ourselves. And I look forward to having somebody take on an editor-in-chief role and be a female soon, hopefully.
Absolutely. And with that positive message, Dr. Dimitriades, if perhaps we should close, since I know we're running a little late. I appreciate everyone having such fantastic presentations and great questions, and we'll stay a little bit longer if there's additional questions, but I don't want to hold folks late. There's one last question from Kyla Hildebrand. For each presenter, if you could give one piece of advice for the audience today about how we can best support our colleagues, and then we'll close.
That's a tough one, because there's so many things that you could do. Yeah,
I think asking people how they're doing right now and always, and just like the idea of not assuming you know what's going on in anybody's, that you assume, even somebody who you think they're having the best day or most successful career or a great paper. Right now, especially, I think we don't know all the things that are going on beyond even your sex and your race and the ideas of racism in this country, or what else is going on in the world, or COVID, and family members, just to be sort of try to not assume we know anything about what they're going through, and being an empathetic ear and asking people how they're doing, I think, is the best we can do right now.
Yeah, I think, I agree that connecting is really important during this time. And many times we're so busy at work, and we're just very busy. And so taking time to ask our colleagues, how are you doing, is very important. And I would add to that I think it's very powerful when women and underrepresented minority groups support verbally in a group setting their colleagues. So if someone has presented something, I find that if it's a man, they tend to get a lot of praise, and when it's a woman, it doesn't always happen that way. And so I think that if everyone actually verbally in those settings where we're in a group and there is something that a woman does to encourage that woman publicly, I think is actually very powerful. So that would be something I would say. try.
And Dr. Davis, I'd love to take that one step further and put in a plug for sponsorship for all of us. Really taking the time to look at your colleagues and seeing their work. And we all have connections with other people in other places. This is our opportunity to advertise for our colleagues that we work with, that we enjoy their work, and we can take a moment to put in a plug for someone to do a grand round in a different institution, to give a lecture, especially now on video, to do things that really promote their work, as well as allowing you to be a good citizen of the earth, basically. So.
Yeah.
I think that's a lovely point. And also re-highlighting what you mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Dimitriadis, the find an immunologist. If everyone can go on and update their profile with their focus and their topics of interest and any ways of reaching them on social media or on their websites, it's there for you to help you promote yourself and to help you make connections among colleagues.
Thank you all so much for your presentations today. This is great. I hope this fosters a lot of good discussion, that everybody can go back to their institutions and think of ways to help implement some change, to be the change that they want to see in their places of work. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.